All right, moving forward with the lab, we're now moving into the spinal cord, and that's where we see these first four highlighted items on this model here. So to begin with those initial features, we're seeing, of course, the spinal cord coming down, and as it tapers to an end, there's that conus medullaris, that inferior tip of the spinal cord. And we have the bundle of nerves that are hanging down from that, known as a cauda equina. We could take a look here, spanning along the lateral side of the spinal cord, these pink structures. This is where we see collectively the sympathetic chain ganglia. And we could zoom in closer now, you notice, for that conus medullaris and the whole bundle hanging down from there. That's that term. The cauda equina is referencing the entire bundle, whereas specifically the term here, the filum terminale, that's the direct midline of the cauda equina. So we notice the label here, and it's this ligament right in the center of the cauda equina. And we'll go back to the zoomed in view. And so you can see it right here in the center. Just that very medial section only is the filum terminale. And here's a closer look for the sympathetic chain ganglia in pink. So now we're moving on to a horizontal section of the spinal cord. And that's where we're going to see all of these attached structures. So we'll start with the meninges, and then we'll move into the white matter and the gray matter. So we have one model here with a lot of detail to it. So starting with the meninges, we have this first layer here is where we have the dura mater. And the next layer right against it now is the arachnoid mater. And then we span across the gap, and the white line right here, right against the spinal cord, that's the pia mater. We have the white matter of the spinal cord itself, and these are known as the columns. And there's a posterior white column, a lateral white column, and an anterior white column up front. A big hint for this model, the spinous process is posterior. So this is the posterior white column, lateral white column, anterior white column. And the same idea for the gray matter. We have a dorsal gray horn, a lateral gray horn, and a ventral gray horn, with the middle section here being the gray commissure. So we went through the white matter section, the gray matter sections, and then lastly, epidural space, central canal, the fissure, and the sulcus. And that's what we see now here. Epidural space filled with adipose tissue. And we notice the epidural space is directly superficial, once again, to the dura mater. So that term, epidural space, central canal, the small little hole right in the center of the spinal cord. And again, the spinous process is posterior on the vertebra, posterior side of the body. And it's now this groove here on the posterior side of the spinal cord is the posterior median sulcus. And on the opposite side, you see it's a wider gap. On the anterior side, there's an anterior median fissure. So now branching off of the spinal cord, represented here by the yellow wires, we have the dorsal root, And then that leads over to a dorsal root ganglion. And the opposite of that, up front, we have the ventral root. And now we have an area where the two different roots, of course, come very close together. And then they branch out again. And this is where we see the ventral ramus, the larger branch coming forward is a ventral ramus. And to the back here, a dorsal ramus. The final structure to point out is a denticulate ligament. The denticulate ligaments are seen here. So right in this area is where we see a denticulate ligament. And it's a branch of the pia mater. Again, this layer right against the spinal cord. And the lateral extension of it, these are the denticulate ligaments. So all of this area, we could zoom in a little closer and we'll go through this. So now the epidural space, just deep to that is the dura mater. The next layer in here is arachnoid mater. We're going to skip over this area, subarachnoid space, and then we get to the pia mater. We then have, of course, the white matter, and we have the posterior white column, and they're in a pair, lateral white columns, which are paired, and then the anterior white columns. The gray matter, we have the dorsal horn, and just one hint, the dorsal horn is longer and extends to the surface, whereas up front, the ventral horn is surrounded by all this white matter. And then the bulge to the side, the lateral gray horn. We can see the central canal, and the gray matter surrounding it is the gray commissure. Up front, another hint of anterior side, the wider gap, anterior median fissure. It's got to be up front, as the name implies. And the narrow crevice on the back, posterior median sulcus. Branching out of the dorsal side from the dorsal gray horn. That's where we see the area of the dorsal root. And up front, here's the ventral root. A similar model, like so, we have the three-dimensional part and just this flat panel. So again, there's all the horns to the gray matter, anterior, lateral, and again, the posterior gray horn is much longer. The central portion, the gray commissure, the white matter columns. So this being the anterior white column. There's the red and black wires here representing that ventral root versus the green and yellow, the dorsal root. And only connected to the dorsal side is where you see the bulge of the dorsal root ganglion. And you see how the two come together and then they have branches. For this model, this is the ventral ramus. Again, the bigger, thicker one that is anterior, and the posterior dorsal ramus. And from the flat panel, a good look at the central canal, the posterior median sulcus versus the anterior median fissure. And again, all the gray matter surrounding the central canal, the area of the gray commissure. And the final part for this lab, we have a chart here where we have the names of plexuses and then the various nerves that branch from each plexus. We also have the distribution, a description of where that nerve travels to. So that's right here in the chart for you, the distribution of the nerve. And there's no neat mnemonic for this section. Okay, so that's just right here in the charts, this information. So we'll go through the plexuses first, and then we'll point out the individual nerves. And we have the model here. So just a representation of the skeleton, and then we have the positioning of the various nerves. So starting up in the area of the neck, higher in the cervical region, of course, the cervical plexus, extending down the arm, extending the brachium, the area of the brachial plexus. Now going all the way down to the lumbar region. This is where we have the lumbar plexus. And then just inferior to that, near the location of the sacral vertebrae, there is a sacral plexus. So now let's go back to the nerves. And we could use this here. So we have this labeling of the same model, you notice. And we've pointed out now the various plexuses. So now go to the individual nerves. The first one here, the phrenic nerve, that happens to be the only nerve we're going to learn from the cervical plexus. So we see that just coming down here. Just that nerve dropping down is that phrenic nerve, just a short segment of it seen. For the brachial plexus, we have a number of nerves. So starting here, axillary nerve. This is now one right here. It's on the posterior side. So passing through the underarm, the axilla. And again, it's wrapping to the posterior side. Is that area of the axillary nerve. Musculocutaneous is the most lateral branch of the brachial plexus. So that very most lateral branch. Whereas now median, ulnar, and radial, we could just follow those down to the forearm. And you notice the hands in anatomical position. So the most lateral side by the radius bone, that's where we have the radial nerve. The most medial, right along the ulna, that bone, that's where we have the ulnar nerve. And between those two, right down the center of the forearm, that's where we have the median nerve. So now moving on to thoracic nerves. There's just individual thoracic nerves between the ribs. There's no plexus, just the individual 12 pairs of thoracic nerves. So now getting to the lumbar plexus, we have the obturator nerve. So that's what we're seeing here. This positioning of the obturator nerve. Whereas now the femoral nerve, you just have to look for the head of the femur. And it's the nerve that's running right past that, hence the name, femoral nerve. And now a branch from the femoral nerve, it branches, and we just have to follow the very medial branch coming all the way down. And that's now the saphenous nerve that branches from femoral, the very medial branch from femoral. And to finish with the sciatic nerve, we're starting here from the area of the sacral plexus. And the sciatic nerve is actually running right near the hamstrings. So it'd be on the posterior side of the thigh. And the sciatic nerve is going to split to form both the medial side and the lateral branch. So if we take a look at this leg, the leg is laterally rotated. We could go back to this figure. So you can see that left leg on the model is laterally rotated. So from following the sciatic nerve, the nerve and the branch that continues to go down, in this case you see posterior to the tibia, that is the tibial nerve. And then we can see this lateral branch starting here and coming down here. And that's where we can see the common fibular nerve.